Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast, AI and Architectural Design, Chapter 5, Style, Memory, and Bias, the Hidden Layers of AI. In the previous chapter, we examined the tension between control and surrender and how the designer's role shifts from producing form to navigating possibilities. The process unfolded not as a linear execution of intention, but as a negotiation between prompts and responses, decisions and variations. Control was no longer absolute, it became distributed, exercised through selection rather than imposition. But once design becomes a negotiation, another question inevitably emerges. What exactly are these possibilities made of? What shapes the outputs that designers are asked to evaluate, select, and refine? Artificial intelligence does not generate in a vacuum. A vast accumulation informs every output of data, images, texts, patterns, and associations drawn from existing material. This accumulation functions as a form of memory, not memory in the human sense, but a structured repository of references that the system draws upon when generating responses. What appears as a new idea is often a recombination of what has already been seen. This condition is not entirely unfamiliar to architecture. Design has always operated through reference. Precedents, typologies, and historical examples inform the development of new projects. No design emerges entirely independent of what came before. However, in traditional practice, these references are often selectively engaged, consciously chosen, and critically interpreted. With AI, the process becomes less transparent. The references remain present, but their selection is embedded within the system. This embeddedness introduces a layer of opacity. The designer encounters the output, but not the full set of influences that produced it. The image appears coherent, sometimes even compelling, yet the logic behind it is not immediately accessible. The process is visible in terms of interaction, but hidden in terms of origin. What is seen is the result. What is concealed is the structure that generated it. Within this structure, style emerges as a significant factor. AI systems are particularly effective at reproducing and blending stylistic patterns. They can generate images that resemble specific architectural languages, historical periods, or visual tendencies. This ability can be useful, allowing designers to explore variations quickly. However, it also raises a critical issue. Style can be mistaken for thinking. When outputs appear refined or visually convincing, there is a tendency to attribute depth to them. The surface suggests coherence, which is often accepted without further examination. Yet style in itself does not constitute design thinking. It is a layer that can mask the absence of conceptual clarity. The risk is not that AI produces style, but that style becomes sufficient. This is where bias begins to operate. The datasets that inform AI systems are not neutral. They reflect particular cultural, geographical, and historical conditions. Certain styles, forms, and references are more prevalent than others. As a result, AI-generated outputs tend to reproduce these patterns. What appears to be a range of possibilities may in fact be a repetition of dominant tendencies. Bias, in this context, is not always explicit. It does not necessarily manifest as a clear distortion. It operates more subtly through preference, frequency, and familiarity. Certain types of architecture appear more often. Certain spatial arrangements are more readily generated. Over time, these patterns begin to shape expectations. The designer may come to accept them as natural or inevitable. This has significant implications for design thinking. If embedded biases already filter the available options, the act of selection is constrained. The designer is not choosing from an open field, but from a structured set of possibilities. The process of negotiation is influenced by conditions that are not immediately visible. At the same time, this condition reveals something that has always been present in design. Architecture has never been free from bias. Cultural norms, economic forces, and historical precedents have always shaped what is considered appropriate, desirable, or possible. AI does not introduce bias into design, it amplifies and accelerates it. It makes patterns more apparent, but also more pervasive. In this sense, AI functions not only as a generator, but as a reflector. It reflects the dominant tendencies embedded in its data, but it also reflects the designer's choices. The interaction between prompt and output becomes a site where these layers intersect. The designer is not only responding to the system, but also to the accumulated history it carries. This intersection creates an opportunity for critical engagement. If style can mask the absence of thinking, it can also be used as a point of entry for analysis. Why does a particular output appear convincing? What references does it draw upon? What assumptions does it carry? By asking these questions, the designer moves beyond surface evaluation and begins to engage with the underlying structure. Memory, in this context, becomes more than a technical feature. It becomes a conceptual condition. The system's memory is not simply a storage of data, it is a shaping force. It determines what can be generated, how it can be combined, and what appears plausible. The designer, therefore, is not only working with a tool, but with a field of accumulated references. This field is not static. It evolves as datasets expand and models are updated. However, its influence remains. The outputs are always situated within a broader context of existing material. The idea of complete originality becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Instead, design emerges as a process of transformation, of selecting, adapting, and reconfiguring what is already present. This does not diminish creativity. On the contrary, it redefines it. Creativity becomes less about producing something entirely new and more about navigating and reshaping existing conditions. The designer's role is not to escape reference, but to engage with it critically. AI makes this engagement more immediate, but also more complex. In the design studio, this complexity becomes evident in the way students interact with AI-generated outputs. There is often an initial attraction to visually compelling images. Certain outputs stand out, not because of their conceptual strength, but because of their stylistic clarity. The challenge is to move beyond this initial response, to question why an image appears successful, and whether that success is grounded in thinking or in appearance. This shift requires a change in how design is discussed. Instead of focusing solely on what is seen, attention must be directed towards how it is produced. The process must be interrogated not only in terms of prompts and iterations, but also in terms of the references and patterns that shape the outputs. The visible process must be connected to the hidden structure. This is where the notion of layers becomes useful. The output is not a singular entity, but a composition of multiple layers: stylistic patterns, accumulated references, embedded biases, and immediate prompts. To understand the design, these layers must be unpacked. The visible surface must be read in relation to the invisible structure. If the previous chapter positioned control as negotiation, this chapter reveals the conditions of that negotiation. The designer is not interacting with a neutral system, but with a structured field of influences. The task is not only to select from available options, but to understand how those options are shaped. This understanding does not lead to a simple resolution. Bias cannot be entirely removed, nor can reference be eliminated. But awareness changes the nature of engagement. The designer becomes more attentive to the conditions under which design emerges. The process becomes less about accepting outputs and more about interrogating them. In the next chapter, we will move from these hidden layers to the question of authorship and examine how creativity is redefined in a context where ideas emerge through interaction rather than individual production. The discussion will shift from structure to agency, from what shapes the output to who can claim it. Because once the layers behind the design are revealed, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who or what is responsible for the result? And how is authorship understood when design is no longer a solitary act? This concludes Chapter 5 of AI and Architectural Design, Style, Memory, and Bias, the hidden layers of AI. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.